Welcome to the channel. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Where are you listening from right now, and what time is it where you are? Let us know in the comments. I read every single one. If you enjoy deep history, forgotten truths, and stories that go beyond textbooks, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more immersive history. Today, we drift into the shadow of ancient Rome to uncover what happened to the missing half of the Colosseum and the forgotten truths history rarely tells. For nearly 2,000 years, the Colosseum has dominated the heart of Rome, rising from the earth like a scar left behind by history itself. It is one of the most recognized structures on the planet, photographed by millions, studied by scholars, admired by travelers, and used endlessly as a symbol of ancient power. Yet despite its fame, despite its constant presence in textbooks, documentaries, and postcards, there is something deeply unsettling about it, something most people notice but rarely stop to question. The Colosseum is broken, not cracked, not weathered, broken. One entire side is missing, torn away as if some invisible force reached down and ripped half of it from the earth. The northern wall still rises in layered arches, proud and defiant, while the southern side simply collapses into absence, an ancient giant standing unevenly, incomplete, exposed. And that leads to a question that refuses to stay silent. Why, how does the greatest amphitheater ever built, constructed by the most powerful empire the world had ever known, end up like this? What happened to the missing half of the Colosseum? Where did it go? And more disturbingly, why was it never rebuilt? Most ruins fade gently, stones fall over centuries, walls erode slowly under wind and rain, but the Colosseum's damage is not subtle. It is violent, sudden, intentional in its aftermath, and the story behind it is far more unsettling than most guided tours will ever tell you. When people imagine the fall of Rome, they often picture barbarian invasions, flaming torches, and legions collapsing beneath waves of enemies. It feels natural to assume that the Colosseum must have been destroyed by war. After all, Rome was invaded many times: Visigoths, Vandals, Ostrogoths, names that echo with destruction. But here is the first uncomfortable truth. No invading army ever destroyed half of the Colosseum. Not once. The structure survived the sack of Rome in 410 AD. It survived the Vandals in 455. It stood while emperors fell, while political systems collapsed, while Christianity replaced paganism. Through chaos and collapse, the Colosseum remained standing, whole, intact, and functional long after gladiatorial games had ended. So if enemies didn't destroy it, then what did? To understand the mystery of the missing half, you have to stop thinking of the Colosseum as a ruin and start thinking of it as a witness, a silent observer that has watched Rome transform from empire to ashes, from pagan capital to Christian city, from ancient powerhouse to medieval battleground. And like all witnesses, it carries scars. The Colosseum was never meant to be fragile. When construction began under Emperor Vespasian around 72 AD, this was not just another building. It was a political statement carved in stone. Built on land once stolen by Nero for his private palace, the Colosseum was designed to return power to the people, to prove that Rome's rulers served the masses, not themselves. Everything about it screamed permanence. Massive travertine limestone blocks, Roman concrete stronger than anything the modern world could produce until recently, a design so advanced that tens of thousands of people could enter and exit within minutes. An architectural marvel that modern stadiums still imitate today. This was not a building Rome expected to lose. For centuries, it stood complete, perfectly oval, balanced, symmetrical. Its arches framed the sky, its corridors echoed with footsteps, its arena floor soaked in blood and sand. Even after gladiatorial combat faded, Even after Rome's population shrank dramatically, the Colosseum remained, a towering reminder of what Rome once was, which makes its current state all the more disturbing. Because at some point in history, the Colosseum did not slowly decay. It was violently changed. Visitors today often assume that time did the damage, that age alone eroded half the structure, but time is not that selective. Time does not destroy one side while sparing the other. Time does not leave clean vertical cuts through history. Something else happened, something decisive, and the clue lies not in war, but in the ground beneath Rome itself. Rome sits in a region shaped by ancient geological forces, volcanoes, fault lines, unstable earth. This is not a quiet landscape. For centuries, earthquakes have rippled through central Italy, sometimes gentle, sometimes catastrophic. Most ancient structures suffered damage from these tremors. Temples collapsed, walls cracked, statues fell, but in most cases, cities rebuilt. The Colosseum was different, because when disaster finally struck it with full force, Rome was no longer Rome. By the time the most devastating earthquake hit in the mid-14th century, the city was a shadow of its former self. The empire was long gone, wealth had drained away, power had shifted. Rome was no longer the center of the world. It was a struggling medieval city surrounded by memories too large to maintain. When the earth shook violently in 1349, it was not just another tremor, it was catastrophic. The southern side of the Colosseum collapsed almost entirely. Arches gave way, massive stone blocks crashed down, entire sections fell into rubble. The amphitheater, once balanced and whole, was suddenly wounded beyond recognition. And this is where history takes a turn that few people expect. Rome did not rush to repair it. No imperial engineers arrived. No grand restoration began. No effort was made to return the Colosseum to its former shape. Instead, something far more revealing happened. The ruins were left exposed, and over time, people began to look at the broken Colosseum not as a monument, but as an opportunity, because in medieval Rome, stone was valuable. Marble was priceless, and the Colosseum was filled with both. The missing half of the Colosseum didn't disappear in a single moment. It wasn't swallowed by the earth. It wasn't erased by an enemy army. It was taken piece by piece, block by block, stone by stone. But before we reach that truth, it's important to understand something deeper, something psychological. Civilizations don't just collapse physically. They collapse mentally. By the Middle Ages, the Colosseum no longer represented pride. It represented a pagan past, a violent past, a reminder of emperors, gods, and spectacles that no longer fit the world Rome had become. The games were gone, the crowds were gone, the meaning was gone, and when meaning disappears, preservation soon follows. People began to see the Colosseum not as something sacred, but as something useful. A giant ready-made quarry in the center of the city. Its fallen stones were already cut, already shaped, already transported by history itself. Why quarry a mountain when Rome had one standing in front of it? And so the missing half of the Colosseum began its second life, not as a monument, but as raw material. Yet even before the dismantling reached its peak, the damage itself had already reshaped how people saw the structure. The broken side exposed its interior, revealing corridors, support systems, and layers that were never meant to be seen. The Colosseum became vulnerable, not just physically, but symbolically. It was no longer untouchable. And that is perhaps the most dangerous moment in the life of any monument, because once something ancient is no longer feared, no longer respected, no longer protected by belief, it becomes easy to destroy. The missing half of the Colosseum is not just an architectural mystery. It is evidence of a moment when Rome stopped caring about what it had been And that is the real beginning of the story, because from that moment forward, the Colosseum was no longer fighting time. It was fighting humanity, and humanity was winning. This is not just the story of a building, it is the story of how greatness is dismantled, not by enemies, but by those who inherit it. And as we continue, the question grows darker. If half of the Colosseum could vanish in plain sight, what else from history disappeared the same way, used, reused, and forgotten? Because the stones of the Colosseum did not die, they simply learned to hide. When the Colosseum was new, Rome did not see it as a ruin, a relic, or a mystery. It was alive. It breathed with the sound of crowds, the smell of sweat and sand, the roar of animals, and the metallic taste of blood in the air. To understand what was lost, you must first understand what once existed, not as broken stone, but as a living machine of power, spectacle, and control. The Colosseum was born in a moment when Rome wanted to remind the world who it was. In the year 69 AD, Rome had been torn apart by civil war. Emperors rose and fell in rapid succession. Trust in leadership was shattered. Then came Vespasian, a soldier, emperor who understood something critical. Rome did not just need stability, it needed a symbol. Something vast enough to command awe, something public enough to win loyalty, something eternal enough to erase the memory of chaos. So he chose the most powerful statement possible. He built a monument for the people on land stolen back from a tyrant. Where Nero once stood watching his private artificial lake shimmer beside his golden palace, Vespasian ordered that the lake be drained. In its place would rise an amphitheater unlike anything the world had ever seen. Not a temple to a god, not a palace for an emperor, but a structure meant to hold the masses themselves. This alone was revolutionary. Construction began around 72 AD, powered by the spoils of war, much of it taken from Jerusalem after the Roman victory in Judea. Tens of thousands of enslaved laborers worked for years, carving travertine limestone from quarries, hauling it across miles, and fitting it together with mathematical precision. Iron clamps bound stones without mortar. Roman concrete filled the hidden bones of the structure, giving it strength that modern engineers still struggle to fully replicate. Nothing about the Colosseum was accidental. Its oval shape was designed to maximize visibility. No matter where you sat, you could see death unfold in front of you. 80 entrances allowed crowds to flow in and out with terrifying efficiency. Social hierarchy was built into the stone itself. Senators closest to the arena, common citizens higher up, women and the poor pushed to the top, closer to the sky than the action below. The Colosseum did not just reflect Roman society. It enforced it. When it was inaugurated in 80 AD under Emperor Titus, the opening games lasted 100 days. 100 days of killing, spectacle, and celebration. Thousands of animals slaughtered. Gladiators fighting not just each other, but fate itself. Exotic beasts from distant lands brought to Rome to remind the crowd that the empire stretched beyond imagination. The Colosseum was Rome's world in miniature. Africa roared through lions, the East bled through prisoners, the provinces died so the capital could feel alive, and through it all, the structure stood firm, complete, balanced, immense. This is what makes its later destruction so haunting. Because for centuries after its opening, the Colosseum remained whole. Long after gladiator games were officially banned in the early 5th century, the structure did not collapse into irrelevance. It adapted. Animal hunts continued. Public events still took place. The massive building remained a landmark, a reference point, a constant presence in a city that was otherwise changing rapidly. Rome's population shrank. Wealth drained away. Political power shifted east to Constantinople. But the Colosseum endured, still towering over streets filled with far fewer people, than it was built to serve. Imagine that silence. A stadium designed for 50,000 voices, standing mostly empty, its arches casting long shadows over narrow medieval streets, its corridors echoing not with cheers, but with wind, yet even in this quiet it remained intact. This tells us something important. The Colosseum was not abandoned immediately. It was not forgotten overnight. It did not decay simply because Rome declined. For generations, it survived intact in a world that no longer knew what to do with it. Which raises a disturbing question. If the Colosseum stood whole for centuries after Rome's fall, then its destruction cannot be blamed on collapse alone. It must be blamed on choice. To medieval Romans, the Colosseum was a paradox. It was too large to ignore, too solid to disappear, and too tied to a pagan past to fully embrace. It loomed over daily life, a reminder of an age of emperors and gods that no longer ruled the city. Christianity had transformed Rome's identity. Martyrdom replaced spectacle, salvation replaced entertainment, and yet the Colosseum, once soaked in blood for pleasure, still stood, silent and defiant. For some, it was a symbol of cruelty, for others, a reminder of lost greatness. For many, simply a massive object in the way. But while its meaning was debated, its structure remained. The Colosseum in its complete form was not just impressive, it was intimidating. Its walls rose like cliffs. Its arches framed the sky. Its sheer scale dwarfed everything around it. Medieval homes clustered against its base like children beside a giant. And because it was whole, it was still feared. Feared structures survive longer than loved ones. As long as the Colosseum stood intact, dismantling it was dangerous. The engineering that made it strong also made it unpredictable. Remove the wrong stone, and entire sections could collapse. For centuries, that danger protected it better than any law. But the protection would not last forever, because the Colosseum's strength depended on balance, and balance, once lost, is never easily restored. When the structure was complete, forces were distributed evenly. Weight flowed through arches, down columns, into foundations designed to absorb pressure. This is why the Colosseum survived smaller earthquakes for hundreds of years. But once nature struck with enough force to break that balance, everything changed. The moment the Colosseum ceased to be whole, it ceased to be safe, and that moment transformed it from an untouchable monument into a vulnerable ruin. But before that happened, before the collapse, before the dismantling, it is important to pause and understand just how extraordinary the complete Colosseum truly was. It was not merely a building. It was a statement of dominance. Every arch whispered Rome's mastery of engineering. Every tier announced control over nature and humanity alike. The Colosseum was proof that Rome could organize chaos, command crowds, and turn violence into ritual. This is why its completeness mattered. A whole Colosseum meant a whole Rome. Even after the empire fractured politically, the intact amphitheater suggested continuity. It stood as evidence that Rome's past greatness had not entirely vanished. As long as it stood whole, the illusion of permanence remained. That illusion died when the structure was broken, and once broken, it became something else entirely. But at this stage in the story, before the earth shook violently, before stones were torn out and reused, the Colosseum still existed as its builders intended. Silent, yes, repurposed at times, yes, but still standing, still complete, still commanding space and memory. Which is why the loss feels so profound, because the missing half of the Colosseum is not just missing stone, it is missing certainty. It represents the exact moment when Rome stopped being a civilization that preserved and became one that scavenged. And that transition did not happen while the Colosseum was whole. It happened only after that wholeness was shattered. The complete Colosseum was too powerful to ignore, too dangerous to dismantle, too symbolic to destroy casually. It took a fracture, physical and psychological, to begin its undoing. So when we look at the Colosseum today, uneven and exposed, we are not just seeing the effects of time. We are seeing the aftermath of a moment when balance was lost. And once balance is lost, even the greatest structures in human history become vulnerable, because greatness, like stone, only survives as long as the world believes it should. For centuries, the Colosseum had endured everything the world threw at it. Empires rose and fell around it. Emperors vanished into history. Religions replaced one another. Rome itself transformed from the capital of a global empire into a fractured medieval city, struggling to remember who it once was. Through all of this, the Colosseum remained standing, silent, massive, and whole. It had survived wars. It had survived neglect. It had survived the slow draining of Rome's population and power. What it could not survive was the earth beneath it. Italy has never been geologically calm. The land itself is restless, shaped by volcanic forces and deep fault lines that stretch beneath cities older than memory. Romans knew this well. They felt tremors. They recorded earthquakes. They rebuilt when damage occurred. Their architecture was, in many ways, a response to this reality: arches that redistributed weight, concrete that absorbed stress, foundations that flexed rather than snapped. The Colosseum was designed with these dangers in mind, and for hundreds of years it worked. Minor earthquakes shook Rome again and again between late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. Walls cracked, statues toppled, temples collapsed, but the Colosseum endured, its vast oval distributing seismic forces with astonishing efficiency. When damage occurred, it was local, manageable, and repairable, but the earth does not always strike gently. In the middle of the 14th century, Europe was already on its knees. The Black Death was tearing through populations, wiping out entire communities. Political authority was fragile. Wealth was scarce. Rome itself was no longer the thriving city it had once been. It was partially abandoned, its population a fraction of what it had been during imperial times. It was in this weakened world that disaster struck. In 1349, a massive earthquake ripped through central Italy. It was one of the most destructive seismic events Rome had experienced in centuries. The ground convulsed violently, buildings collapsed, streets split. Churches cracked open. The city was thrown into chaos, and the Colosseum finally broke. The southern side of the structure took the full force of the shock. The ground beneath it gave way unevenly, destabilizing the carefully balanced system of arches and supports. In moments, sections that had stood for over 1,000 years began to fail. Arches cracked, columns buckled, stone blocks, some weighing several tons, came crashing down. This was not gradual decay. This was sudden destruction. The southern outer wall collapsed almost entirely, spilling rubble into the surrounding area. The once perfect oval was torn open, exposing the Colosseum's interior like a wound. The symmetry that had protected it for centuries was gone. And with that loss of balance, the Colosseum entered a new phase of its existence. What makes this moment so significant is not just the destruction itself, but what followed, or rather, what did not. Rome did not rebuild. In the age of emperors, a monument of this scale would have been restored immediately. Engineers would have stabilized the foundations. New stone would have replaced the fallen. The building would have been made whole again, stronger than before, but this was no longer imperial Rome. By 1349, there was no centralized power capable of such a project, no imperial treasury overflowing with wealth, no political will to preserve a structure that belonged to a past few still understood or valued. The Colosseum, once a symbol of Roman unity and dominance, had become an orphan of history. And when something loses its protectors, its fate changes. The earthquake did more than damage stone. It shattered perception. As long as the Colosseum had stood whole, it inspired a kind of awe that discouraged interference. It was too large, too solid, too intimidating. Even abandoned, it felt invincible. After the collapse, that illusion was gone. The broken southern side exposed the interior structure, corridors, vaults, passageways that had once been hidden. The building no longer felt eternal. It felt vulnerable, mortal, and once vulnerability is visible, human behavior changes. The rubble left by the earthquake did not remain untouched for long. Fallen stones were already cut, already shaped, already nearby. In a city where resources were scarce and construction materials expensive, the ruins of the Colosseum suddenly looked less like a tragedy and more like a solution. But before people began to take from it openly, there was a period of uncertainty. The Colosseum stood wounded but still towering. One half remained upright, its arches still aligned, its walls still formidable. The other half lay shattered, collapsed into chaos. The contrast was stark, a visual representation of imbalance. This imbalance was dangerous. Without the southern wall, the structural forces that had once been evenly distributed now pressed unevenly through the remaining arches. Engineers of the time understood this intuitively, even if they lacked modern calculations. Removing more stone could trigger further collapse. Entering certain areas could be fatal, and yet necessity overrides fear. Rome in the 14th century was not a city of abundance. The population had been ravaged by plague. Political instability was constant. Powerful families fought for control. The papacy itself was often absent, ruling from afar. There was no unified vision for preservation, only immediate needs. Stones from the fallen sections began to disappear. At first it was subtle, a block removed here, a column fragment taken there, materials repurposed for small projects, walls, houses, repairs. Each act seemed insignificant on its own. The Colosseum was enormous. Surely it could spare a few stones, but this logic is how monuments die. The earthquake of 1349 did not destroy half of the Colosseum in one moment. It simply made destruction possible. It broke the seal. Before the collapse, dismantling the Colosseum would have required deliberate, organized effort. After the collapse, the work had already been started by nature itself. Humans only had to continue, and they did. Yet it is important to understand that the earthquake was not seen at the time as a historic turning point. Medieval Romans did not say, "This is the day the Colosseum was lost." To them, it was just another disaster in an age full of them. What they could not see was the long shadow this moment would cast, because the earthquake marked the point of no return. From that day forward, the Colosseum was no longer a monument waiting to be restored. It was a ruin waiting to be used. The southern collapse also changed how the structure interacted with the environment. Rainwater pooled differently, foundations eroded unevenly, vegetation took root in cracks and joints, slowly prying stones apart. What had once been a sealed system became exposed to centuries of weather. Nature continued what the earthquake began, but nature alone cannot explain the scale of what was lost. The missing half of the Colosseum is not just the result of seismic violence. It is the result of human response to that violence. Other ancient structures damaged by earthquakes were repaired. Churches were rebuilt. Walls were reinforced. Even smaller ruins were stabilized when communities valued them. The Colosseum was not. Why? Because by the 14th century, its original purpose was gone. It no longer served the city. It no longer generated identity or unity. It belonged to a Rome that no longer existed, and without purpose, preservation becomes optional. The earthquake stripped the Colosseum of its illusion of immortality. It revealed that even the greatest achievements of Rome could fall, could crack, could be reduced to rubble. Once that truth was visible, reverence faded. The fallen stones became resources. The standing half became a backdrop to daily life. The Colosseum was no longer a sacred relic of imperial power. It was part of the urban landscape, subject to the same practical considerations as any other structure. This shift in mindset is crucial. The earth may have delivered the blow, but humans decided the outcome. They chose not to rebuild. They chose not to protect. They chose to adapt the ruin to their needs, and in doing so, they ensured that the missing half would never return. The earthquake of 1349 was not just a geological event. It was a cultural rupture. It separated the Colosseum's life as a living monument from its afterlife as a source of material, legend, and loss. From that moment on, every stone removed, every wall repurposed, every arch left unsupported traced its origin back to that day when the ground shook and Rome did nothing to stop what came next. The Colosseum had survived emperors, invasions, and centuries of neglect. What finally defeated it was a moment when the earth struck hard and humanity chose not to heal the wound, and once that choice was made, the fate of the missing half was sealed. After the earthquake shattered the balance of the Colosseum, something fundamental changed in how Rome related to its most famous monument. The damage was no longer just physical, it was psychological. The moment the southern wall collapsed and the interior of the structure was laid bare, the Colosseum ceased to be an untouchable relic of a vanished empire and became something far more dangerous to its own survival, a resource. Medieval Rome was not a city with excess. It was a city defined by scarcity. The population was small compared to its imperial peak. Wealth was unevenly distributed, and the infrastructure left behind by the empire was far larger than what the city could realistically maintain. Roads, baths, temples, and public buildings surrounded a community that lacked the money, manpower, and political unity to preserve them all. Stone, however, was always in demand. New churches were rising. Noble families were fortifying their homes. Walls needed repair. Bridges had to be strengthened. And high-quality building material was expensive to quarry, cut, and transport. The Colosseum, already damaged and partially collapsed, offered something almost irresistible: enormous quantities of perfectly shaped stone already located in the center of the city. The logic was brutally simple. Why carve fresh stone from distant quarries when Rome's past was standing right there, fractured and available? At first, the dismantling was quiet. No official decrees announced it. No single authority claimed ownership of the ruins. Individuals took stones from fallen sections, especially from areas already reduced to rubble by the earthquake. These early removals likely felt harmless, even sensible. After all, the stones were just lying there. Leaving them unused would have seemed wasteful, but monuments do not disappear all at once. They vanish through habit. As more people took stone, the act became normalized. What had once felt like scavenging began to feel like entitlement. The Colosseum, long abandoned as a venue for spectacle, had no clear function. No one could easily argue why its stones should remain untouched while the city struggled to rebuild itself. And so Rome began, quite literally, to consume its own past. Travertine limestone blocks were removed from collapsed walls and transported to construction sites across the city. Marble, once polished smooth by the footsteps of tens of thousands, was pried loose and repurposed. Even the iron clamps that held the Colosseum together, hidden deep within the stone, were hacked out, leaving behind the pockmarked scars still visible today. Those scars are not damage from time. they are evidence of theft. The missing half of the Colosseum did not vanish into dust. It was redistributed. Its material was absorbed into the living body of medieval and Renaissance Rome, becoming part of new structures that would themselves one day be considered historic. In a sense, the Colosseum did not die, it was dismembered. Some of Rome's most famous buildings carry pieces of it within their walls. Palaces, churches, administrative buildings, and noble residences were constructed using stone taken directly from the amphitheater. Even St. Peter's Basilica, the heart of Catholic Christianity, contains materials quarried from the ruins of ancient Rome, including the Colosseum. This creates a haunting paradox. The monument that once symbolized pagan spectacle and imperial dominance became the physical foundation of Christian Rome. The arena that echoed with the screams of gladiators was slowly transformed into prayer halls, residences, and sacred spaces. The stones that once enclosed violence were reborn as walls meant to shelter faith. But this transformation came at a cost. Each stone removed weakened the remaining structure. The Colosseum's strength depended on the integrity of its arches and the careful distribution of weight. When stones were taken indiscriminately, especially from already damaged areas, the balance grew more unstable, yet the removal continued because there was no single moment when someone said stop. Power in medieval Rome was fragmented. Noble families controlled different districts. The papacy's influence fluctuated. Laws protecting ancient monuments were inconsistent and often ignored. The Colosseum fell into a gray zone, important enough to notice, but not important enough to save. As dismantling increased, the Colosseum began to change shape. Entire sections disappeared. Walls that had survived the earthquake were intentionally pulled down to access more valuable material. What nature had broken, humans accelerated. This process unfolded over centuries. Generation after generation grew up seeing the Colosseum not as a complete structure, but as a partially ruined one. To them, it had always been incomplete. The idea of restoring it to its original form became increasingly abstract, increasingly unrealistic. Why rebuild something no one remembered being whole? And so, stone by stone, the missing half of the Colosseum was integrated into the daily life of the city. People walked past walls built from its remains without knowing or caring where the stone had come from. History was not erased, it was repurposed. Yet the Colosseum's fate was not purely the result of indifference. At times it became a prize. Powerful families recognized the strategic value of the structure itself. Its massive walls and elevated position made it ideal for defense. During periods of conflict, sections of the Colosseum were fortified. Towers were added. The ruins were transformed into a stronghold. This further altered the structure. To make it defensible, parts were modified, reinforced, or removed. Stones were rearranged. New walls cut through ancient corridors. The Colosseum became a living battlefield, its original design overwritten by the needs of survival and dominance. In these moments, destruction was not accidental. It was intentional. The Colosseum was no longer a monument to Rome's past. It was a tool in Rome's present struggles, and tools are used until they break. Over time, even this military use faded. As power structures shifted and warfare evolved, the fortress lost its relevance. The Colosseum returned to being a quarry, a shelter, a ruin inhabited by the poor and the forgotten. Grass grew between stones, trees took root in cracks, livestock wandered through corridors where emperors once walked. The image is almost unbearable when you stop to imagine it. A building once designed to control crowds of 50,000 reduced to a space of abandonment and quiet survival. Yet the dismantling did not go entirely unchallenged. There were moments when voices rose in defense of the Colosseum. Some saw it as a symbol of Rome's identity, a link to a glorious past that should not be entirely erased. Artists, scholars, and later Renaissance thinkers began to view ancient ruins with renewed reverence. But by the time this shift in attitude took hold, the damage was already done. Half the Colosseum was gone. What remained stood not because it had been protected from the beginning, but because the appetite for destruction eventually slowed. The easiest stones to take were gone. The remaining structure was more dangerous to dismantle. And gradually, laws were introduced to prevent further damage. Ironically, what saved the Colosseum was not love, but exhaustion. Rome had taken what it could. The missing half had been absorbed into the city's bloodstream, invisible but present everywhere. The Colosseum itself was left standing in its broken form, a reminder of both grandeur and loss. This is why the structure feels so different from other ruins. It was not abandoned and forgotten in some distant landscape. It stood in the center of a living city while being systematically stripped of its body. People lived beside it, walked through it, and built their lives from it. The destruction happened in plain sight. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part. The missing half of the Colosseum was not lost to time, war, or disaster alone. It was taken deliberately, repeatedly, by people who inherited Rome's greatness but could not, or would not, carry its weight. The Colosseum did not collapse because Rome was weak. It collapsed because Rome was practical, stone was needed, the past was available, and the future demanded materials. In consuming the Colosseum, Rome ensured its survival as a city, but at the cost of one of the greatest monuments ever built. What remains today is not just a ruin, it is a confession, a silent admission that civilizations do not only fall through conquest or catastrophe. Sometimes they dismantle themselves slowly, methodically, using their own achievements as building blocks for something new. And once that process begins, no amount of regret can restore what was taken. The missing half of the Colosseum is everywhere in Rome, hidden in walls, buried beneath plaster, standing unnoticed in structures people pass every day. It is gone, yet it never truly left, because Rome is built on Rome, and the Colosseum paid the price. As the centuries passed and the Colosseum continued to lose stone, identity, and purpose, it did not simply fade into obscurity. Instead, it entered one of the most paradoxical phases of its existence, a transformation so unexpected that it would ultimately determine whether the monument survived at all. The arena that once embodied imperial violence, pagan spectacle, and mass death slowly began to acquire a new and contradictory identity, a place of protection, power, and eventually sanctity. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Rome did not become peaceful. It became fragmented, authority fractured into competing powers, noble families, local warlords, shifting papal influence, and foreign rulers who came and went. In this unstable world, large stone structures were not just reminders of the past, they were strategic assets. The Colosseum, even in its damaged state, was still massive. Its walls were thick, its footprint dominated the surrounding landscape, its height offered visibility and control. To medieval eyes, this made it something far more valuable than a ruin. It made it defensible. Powerful Roman families began to see the Colosseum not as an ancient monument, but as a ready-made fortress. Among them, the Frangipani family stands out. By the 11th and 12th centuries, they had effectively claimed the Colosseum as part of their stronghold, incorporating it into a network of fortified structures across the city. This was not preservation. This was occupation. To turn the Colosseum into a fortress, its interior had to be altered. Walls were built inside ancient corridors. Towers were added. Entrances were blocked or reshaped. Stone was rearranged, cut, and repurposed to suit military needs. The original logic of the structure, designed for crowds and spectacle, was overwritten by the logic of survival and defense. The Colosseum became a battlefield without gladiators. Conflicts between rival families spilled into its shadow. Armed men moved through passageways once filled with spectators. The arena floor, long stripped of its wooden planks and sand, lay exposed to the sky, a hollow space echoing with tension rather than cheers. In this era, the Colosseum was no longer a symbol of Rome's unity. It was a prize to be controlled, and yet, even as it was militarized, something curious happened. The very brutality that once defined the Colosseum began to recede into myth. Gladiators were gone. The games had ended centuries earlier. The memory of organized slaughter blurred into legend, exaggerated and reshaped by storytellers who lived far removed from the empire that had created it. For medieval Christians, the Colosseum's past became a moral tale, a symbol of pagan cruelty, excess, and sin. But moral tales have power, and power can be repurposed. As Christianity tightened its grip on Rome's identity, the Church faced a dilemma. The city was filled with pagan ruins too large to erase and too iconic to ignore. Temples, forums, baths, these structures represented a world Christianity had rejected, yet they dominated the physical landscape of the holy city. The Colosseum posed the greatest challenge of all. It was impossible to destroy completely, too massive to dismantle quickly, too central to erase from memory, so instead of eliminating it, the Church slowly reframed it. A narrative began to form, one that would fundamentally alter the Colosseum's fate. According to this emerging tradition, the Colosseum was a place where countless Christians had been martyred for their faith. Thrown to beasts, executed before roaring crowds, slaughtered for refusing to renounce Christ. The image was powerful, blood soaking the sand, faith standing firm against empire, martyrdom triumphing over cruelty. There was only one problem. Historical evidence for mass Christian executions in the Colosseum is limited and debated. While Christians were persecuted in ancient Rome, and some may indeed have died there, the scale described by later tradition is likely exaggerated. But historical precision was not the point. Meaning was, by declaring the Colosseum a site of martyrdom, the Church achieved something extraordinary. It transformed the amphitheater from a pagan symbol into a Christian one. Violence was no longer celebrated. It was condemned and redeemed. The Colosseum became not a monument to Roman cruelty, but a testament to Christian suffering and faith. This shift changed everything. Once a place is declared sacred, it becomes dangerous to destroy. Gradually, religious symbols were introduced, crosses appeared, small shrines were established, processions passed through the ruins. The Colosseum began to function not just as a physical space, but as a spiritual one, and with sanctity came protection. Popes issued decrees discouraging further dismantling. Though enforcement was uneven, the message was clear. This was no longer just a convenient source of stone. It was holy ground. Ironically, it was not history that saved the Colosseum. It was belief. The same structure that once existed to glorify death through spectacle was now preserved because it symbolized death endured for faith. Its meaning had been inverted, and in that inversion, it found safety. This does not mean destruction stopped immediately. Stones continued to be taken for some time. Habitation continued. The Colosseum remained a rough, contested space. But the scale of damage slowed. The idea of total dismantling faded. Over time, the fortress phase ended as well. Noble families lost interest or power. Warfare shifted. The Colosseum was gradually abandoned as a military asset. What remained was a strange hybrid, part ruin, part shrine, part symbol. The Colosseum had become untethered from its original function, yet anchored by a new one. This transformation also influenced how artists and thinkers viewed the structure. During the Renaissance, scholars and painters began to see the Colosseum as a powerful reminder of both Rome's greatness and its moral failure. It stood as proof of what humanity could build and what it could justify. The broken arches were no longer just damage, they were warnings. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the Colosseum's identity as a sacred site was reinforced further. Pope Benedict XIV formally consecrated it, establishing the stations of the cross within the structure. This act effectively placed the Colosseum under the protection of the Church. From that point forward, large-scale dismantling became unthinkable. The arena that had once fed on blood was now protected in the name of blood shed for faith. The irony is impossible to ignore. A story, part truth, part myth, had succeeded where laws and reverence for history had failed. The Colosseum survived not because Rome valued its past, but because Rome reimagined it. And yet, this salvation came too late to restore what was lost. Half the structure was already gone. Centuries of stone had already been absorbed into the city. The original form could never be recovered. What remained stood as a fragment, preserved not in wholeness but in meaning. This phase of the Colosseum's life reveals something deeply human. When people cannot preserve something for what it was, they preserve it for what it can become. The Colosseum could no longer be saved as a monument to imperial Rome. That identity was too distant, too uncomfortable, too incompatible with the present. But it could be saved as a symbol of moral triumph, spiritual endurance, and sacred memory. And so it was. The fortress walls fell silent. The stone theft slowed. The arena became a place of reflection rather than spectacle. The Colosseum, scarred and incomplete, entered a new kind of eternity, not as a living building, but as a moral monument. Yet even in sanctity it remained broken. Its missing half stood as a reminder that salvation does not reverse damage, it merely halts it. The Colosseum was spared total annihilation, but it was never healed. And perhaps that is why it remains so powerful today. It is not a perfect relic. It is not a frozen moment of glory. It is a survivor, a structure that lived many lives, arena, fortress, quarry, shrine, and bears the marks of each one. The sacred story saved the Colosseum from disappearance, but it also sealed its fate as a ruin forever incomplete. Because once a monument loses its original body, no amount of belief can restore it. All belief can do is protect what remains, and in the case of the Colosseum, what remained was enough to speak, not of triumph, but of transformation, loss, and the strange ways civilizations choose what deserves to survive. Beneath the broken arches and uneven skyline of the Colosseum lies a truth that most visitors never fully confront. What stands today is not simply the remains of an ancient building. It is the visible result of centuries of choices, some driven by fear, some by necessity, some by belief, and many by indifference. The Colosseum's final form, incomplete and exposed, is not an accident of time. It is a conclusion. To understand what the Colosseum ultimately became, you have to look downward. Hidden beneath the arena floor is the hypogeum, a subterranean world of corridors, chambers, lifts, pulleys, and cages. This underground system was invisible to ancient spectators, yet it was the true heart of the spectacle. Here, gladiators waited in silence, listening to the muffled roar of the crowd above. Here, animals were kept in darkness, confused and enraged, moments before being lifted into blinding sunlight and inevitable violence. The hypogeum was not built all at once. It evolved, becoming more complex as Rome perfected its control over spectacle. Trapdoors opened suddenly. Elevators raised lions, bears, and prisoners as if summoned from the underworld itself. The arena was a stage, but the hypogeum was the machinery that made illusion possible. This hidden world matters because it mirrors the fate of the Colosseum itself. Just as the hypogeum was concealed beneath the spectacle, the real story of the Colosseum is hidden beneath the surface narrative of ruin and age. What we see today, the broken walls, the exposed interior, the missing half, is not the result of one dramatic collapse, but of a long, layered process that unfolded quietly over generations. The Colosseum did not fall. It was slowly stripped of certainty. By the time the modern world began to value ancient history as something worth preserving, the Colosseum was already a fragment. Its hypogeum lay buried under debris and earth. Its outer walls were incomplete. Its original form existed only in drawings, texts, and imagination, and yet, even in this broken state, it refused to disappear. This is where the Colosseum becomes something more than architecture. It becomes a warning. Civilizations often imagine that their greatest achievements are permanent, that stone, concrete, and scale guarantee survival. Rome believed this. The Colosseum was built to outlast generations, to project power far beyond the lifetimes of its creators. And in a way, it succeeded. But permanence is not the same as protection. The Colosseum survived not because it was indestructible, but because it was repeatedly reinterpreted. When it ceased to serve one purpose, it was given another. When it became inconvenient, it was exploited. When it was nearly destroyed, it was sanctified. Each transformation allowed it to continue existing, but none restored what was lost. What remains today is a monument shaped by adaptation rather than preservation. This is why the Colosseum feels different from ruins abandoned in deserts or jungles. It did not fade away at the edge of civilization. It stood at the center of a living city, constantly interacting with people who used it, altered it, and redefined it. Every era left its fingerprints. The Empire left grandeur. The Middle Ages left scars. The Church left meaning. The modern world left restoration and reverence, and through it all, the Colosseum endured, not whole, but present. Modern visitors often ask why the Colosseum was never fully restored. Why not rebuild the missing half? Why not return it to its original symmetry and glory? The answer reveals how deeply our understanding of history has changed. Restoring the Colosseum completely would require erasing its story. It would mean pretending that earthquakes, scavenging, fortresses, and sanctification never happened. It would freeze the structure in a single moment of its life, ignoring everything that followed. The Colosseum is not valuable because it represents Rome at its peak. It is valuable because it shows what happens after the peak. The exposed interior, the jagged edges, the uneven walls, these are not flaws to be corrected. They are evidence. They show how time, human need, belief, and neglect interact. They show how even the greatest symbols are vulnerable once their meaning fades. The missing half of the Colosseum teaches a lesson that no intact monument ever could. It teaches that destruction does not always arrive with fire and armies. Sometimes it arrives with practicality, with reuse, with the quiet logic of survival. Rome did not wake up one day and decide to erase its past. It simply needed stone, and that need, repeated across centuries, reshaped one of the greatest structures ever built. This is why the Colosseum resonates so powerfully today. It mirrors our own world. We live surrounded by systems, institutions, and creations that feel permanent: technological empires, political structures, cultural symbols. We assume they will endure because they are large, influential, and deeply embedded in daily life. But the Colosseum reminds us that size is not immunity. Meaning is. As long as something serves a purpose, it is protected. Once that purpose fades, survival depends on reinterpretation. And if reinterpretation fails, dismantling begins, not out of malice, but out of necessity. The Colosseum's survival was never guaranteed. It was negotiated. Each generation decided, consciously or not, what the structure was worth to them: gladiatorial arena, fortress, quarry, shrine, ruin. Heritage site, tourist icon, every identity saved it for a while. None made it whole again. Even today, preservation is an ongoing struggle. Pollution eats at the stone. Millions of visitors wear down surfaces. Restoration projects attempt to stabilize what remains without altering its character. The goal is no longer to reclaim the past, but to prevent further loss. This is the final stage of the Colosseum's long life. Not glory, not utility, but memory. The hypogeum, once hidden, is now exposed and studied. Visitors walk through corridors where fear once lived. The underground machinery is no longer used to create illusion, but to reveal truth. And that truth is uncomfortable. The Colosseum stands as proof that civilizations are most dangerous to their own legacy when they stop understanding it. When a monument becomes inconvenient, its fate is decided not by hatred, but by indifference. The missing half of the Colosseum is not missing because Rome forgot how to build. It is missing because Rome forgot why it should preserve. Yet despite everything, despite earthquakes, scavengers, wars, and centuries of misuse, the Colosseum still stands. Broken, yes. Incomplete, yes. But undeniably present. It has outlived emperors, popes, kingdoms, and ideologies. It has absorbed every attempt to redefine it and emerged as something larger than any single era. Not a monument to Rome's power, but a monument to Rome's humanity, its ambition, cruelty, faith, pragmatism, and contradiction. The Colosseum does not ask to be admired for perfection. It demands to be understood for survival. And perhaps that is why it remains one of the most powerful structures ever built, not because it shows us what Rome achieved at its height, but because it shows us what Rome became when that height was gone. The missing half is not a failure of history. It is history, a reminder carved in absence that even the greatest civilizations do not collapse all at once. They erode, adapt, and consume themselves, stone by stone, until what remains is not what they intended to leave behind, but what the future can no longer ignore. And as long as the Colosseum stands, uneven, scarred, and silent, it will continue to tell that story to anyone willing to look beyond what is missing and understand why it was never replaced.